The Caldrith Empire had swept across the galaxy like a storm that never ended, and in their wake they left nothing but silence and surrender. 47 star systems had fallen to their might in less than 10 years, and each conquest had been swift and absolute. Their warships moved through space with the confidence of predators who had never known defeat, and their weapons tore apart enemy fleets as easily as a human might tear paper. The Caldrith did not negotiate, and they did not compromise because they had never needed to do either of those things, Captain. Daniel Hayes stood on the bridge of the USS Defiant and watched the latest intelligence report scroll across his command screen with growing concern. His ship was a destroyer-class vessel, and compared to the massive dreadnoughts that formed the backbone of the Human Defense Coalition fleet, it was modest in size and firepower. 215 men and women served under his command, and he knew every single one of them by name. Commander Lisa Morgan stood at his right side as she always did, and her expression matched his own mixture of worry and determination. Chief Engineer Peter Griffin was somewhere below in the engine room keeping their fusion reactor running at peak efficiency, while Lieutenant Amy Richardson manned the tactical station with her usual focused intensity. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of computer systems and the occasional beep of incoming data, and Hayes appreciated that quiet because he knew it would not last much longer. The Caldrith fleet had arrived at the edge of human space 3 days ago, and their message had been broadcast to every colony and every military installation within range. The words were simple and brutal in their clarity: surrender completely and immediately or be destroyed without mercy or hesitation. To emphasize their seriousness, the Caldrith had included recordings of their previous conquests, and Hayes had forced himself to watch every horrifying second of those videos. He had seen entire fleets reduced to expanding clouds of debris in mere minutes, and he had seen the Caldrith quantum disruption weapons tear ships apart at the molecular level as if they were made of sand rather than steel. He had seen defensive positions that should have held for weeks collapse in hours, and he had seen species that had fought bravely and desperately cease to exist as independent civilizations. The message was clear and it was effective, and Hayes understood why the Human Defense Coalition had ordered a full retreat of all military forces back toward Earth. Admiral Richard Torres at Central Command had sent the order himself, and his face on the transmission screen had looked 10 years older than it had been just a month before. Every ship was to fall back and establish a defensive perimeter around humanity's homeworld, and every colony that could be evacuated was to be abandoned temporarily. It was the only logical response to an enemy that possessed such overwhelming technological superiority, and Hayes knew that Torres had made the right call from a strategic perspective, but Daniel Hayes had never been particularly good at following orders that he disagreed with, and he had spent the last 48 hours studying every scrap of intelligence data about the Caldrith that humanity possessed. He had read technical analyses of their weapons and shields, and he had reviewed tactical recordings of their battles against other species, and he had pored over strategic assessments of their military doctrine. Most importantly, he had noticed something that everyone else seemed to have missed in their panic. The Caldrith never changed their tactics, and they never adapted their strategies because they had never needed to do so. Every battle followed the same pattern with the same approach vectors and the same targeting priorities and the same formations. They used a diamond formation for their scout forces and a hammer and anvil pattern for their main battle fleets, and they always targeted command ships first, followed by weapons, platforms, and then support vessels. It was efficient and it was effective, and it had worked perfectly against every enemy they had ever faced, but it was also predictable, and predictability could be exploited if someone was clever enough and desperate enough to try. Hayes looked at the star map displayed on the main view screen and studied the position of New Harmony Colony, where the USS Defiant currently maintained orbit. The colony was home to 8,000 civilians, and it had been marked for evacuation, but the transport ships would not arrive for another 6 days. Intelligence suggested that a Caldrith scout force would reach the system in approximately 72 hours, and those 5 ships would be more than enough to glass the entire planet. If they chose to do so, the orders were clear, and Hayes was supposed to withdraw immediately and leave the colonists to their fate, because losing one destroyer trying to defend an indefensible position made no tactical sense. Admiral Torres had been explicit about that, and Hayes respected the man enough to understand his reasoning. But Hayes also understood that sometimes the right decision from a strategic standpoint was not the right decision. From a human standpoint, and he had not joined the military to abandon civilians to alien invaders. Commander Morgan noticed him staring at the star map, and she stepped closer to speak quietly so that the rest of the bridge crew would not hear. She asked if he was planning what she thought he was planning, and her tone suggested that she already knew the answer. Hayes nodded slowly and told her that he was not going to retreat, and that the USS Defiant would remain at New Harmony to face the Caldrith scout force when it arrived. Morgan took a deep breath and then asked the question that mattered most, which was whether he actually thought they could win. Hayes turned to look at her, and his expression was serious, but not grim. He told her honestly that he did not think they could win in any conventional sense, because the Caldrith ships were simply too powerful and too well defended. But he also told her that he had noticed something in the intelligence data, and that he thought there might be a chance to do something that no other species had managed to accomplish. He thought they might be able to hurt the Caldrith and make them bleed and show them that humanity would not simply roll over and surrender. Morgan studied his face for a long moment, and then she nodded and said that she was with him, regardless of what happened. Hayes felt a surge of gratitude because he knew that his crew would follow him into this fight, even though they probably all thought he was planning a suicide mission. He called together his senior staff and explained his decision and his reasoning, and he gave every single officer the chance to transfer off the ship if they wanted to. Not one person took him up on that offer. Lieutenant Amy Richardson at the Tactical Station began running combat simulations based on the intelligence data about Caldrith weapons and shields, while Chief Engineer Griffin started reviewing the specifications for the USS Defiant's experimental composite armor. Dr. Karen White back on Earth had designed that armor as part of a research project, and her theoretical paper suggested it might have some interesting properties when exposed to quantum disruption fields, but it had never been tested in actual combat. Hayes had read those papers 3 times, and he thought he understood what might happen if his theory was correct. The bridge crew worked through the night preparing for the coming battle, and Hayes sent a final message to Admiral Torres, explaining his decision to remain at New Harmony. He knew that Torres would be furious, and that he would probably face a court-martial if he survived, but he also knew that the Admiral would understand why he had made this choice. Sometimes a symbol mattered more than tactical logic, and sometimes one ship standing alone could inspire more hope than an entire fleet in retreat. 3 days later, the Caldrith scout force arrived exactly when intelligence had predicted they would, and they found the USS Defiant waiting for them in a stationary orbit around New Harmony's moon. The 5 alien cruisers moved into their standard diamond formation, and they approached with the casual confidence of apex predators who had never encountered real resistance. On the bridge of the Defiant, Daniel Hayes watched them come, and his hand rested steady on his command chair. The war was about to change forever. The 5 Caldrith cruisers moved through space with deliberate precision, and their hulls gleamed under the light of New Harmony's sun like polished obsidian. Each vessel was twice the size of the USS Defiant, and their weapon arrays bristled with the technology that had shattered fleets across dozens of worlds. On the lead ship, the Caldrith commander studied the single human vessel waiting for them, and felt something close to contempt mixed with mild curiosity. Every other human ship had retreated, according to their intelligence reports, and yet this lone destroyer remained in orbit, as if it could somehow matter. Captain Daniel Hayes stood perfectly still on the bridge of the Defiant and watched the enemy formation approach on the tactical display. Commander Lisa Morgan shifted nervously beside him, and her hand hovered near the communications panel, as if she wanted to say something but could not find the right words. The rest of the bridge crew maintained their positions with professional discipline, but Hayes could feel the tension radiating from every person in the room. They all knew what was coming, and they all understood that conventional wisdom said they should not survive the next 10 minutes, Lieutenant. Amy Richardson broke the silence with a quiet report that the Caldrith ships had achieved optimal firing range and were charging their primary weapon systems. Hayes acknowledged the information with a slight nod, and then gave an order that surprised everyone on the bridge. He told them to power down all non-essential systems and maintain their current stationary position. Morgan turned to stare at him with obvious confusion, because every tactical manual ever written said that a ship should maintain mobility during combat to make targeting more difficult. Hayes met her gaze calmly and told her to trust him. The Caldrith fired first as they always did, and their quantum disruption cannons lit up the darkness of space with pulses of energy that existed somewhere between matter and pure force. These weapons had torn apart the molecular bonds of countless enemy vessels and turned solid metal into clouds of disconnected atoms in microseconds. The bridge crew of the Defiant instinctively braced for impact, and several officers closed their eyes because they did not want to see their own deaths coming. The quantum pulses struck the Defiant's hull with tremendous force, and the entire ship shuddered from bow to stern. Alarms blared across multiple stations and damage control systems activated automatically. But then the alarms stopped and the shuddering ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the bridge. Hayes opened his eyes and immediately checked the damage report on his command screen. The hull integrity was at 94%, and there were no critical system failures and no hull breaches. The crew stared at their displays in complete disbelief because that should not have been possible. Chief Engineer Peter Griffin's voice came through the communication system from deep in the engine room, and his tone carried equal parts shock and excitement. He reported that the experimental composite armor had reacted to the quantum disruption field in a way that nobody had predicted. Instead of allowing the quantum energy to tear apart the molecular structure of the hull, the armor had somehow converted that energy into a harmonic resonance that temporarily strengthened the molecular bonds. The effect had lasted only a few seconds, but it had been enough to protect the ship from what should have been catastrophic damage. Hayes allowed himself a small smile because he had suspected this might happen after reading Dr. Karen White's theoretical papers 3 times. The scientist had hypothesized about quantum-resistant properties in certain composite materials, but her research had been purely theoretical and completely untested. Now they had proof that her theories were correct and that knowledge might be the most valuable weapon humanity possessed in this war. The Caldrith commander stared at his tactical display with something approaching confusion, because his weapons had never failed before. He ordered his ships to fire again with increased power, and the space around the Defiant lit up with another barrage of quantum disruption pulses. Once again, the human ship absorbed the impacts with minimal damage, and once again it remained intact and functional. The Caldrith switched tactics immediately and began firing their secondary weapons, which were conventional, kinetic railguns that hurled massive projectiles at significant fractions of light speed. The railgun rounds slammed into the Defiant's hull with brutal force, and this time the damage was real and significant. Hull plating buckled under the impacts, and several external sensor arrays were torn away completely. Damage control teams scrambled to seal minor breaches and redirect power around damaged systems. But the ship held together, and Hayes gave the order that everyone had been waiting for. He told Lieutenant Richardson to return fire with everything they had. The USS Defiant's missile tubes opened and released a full salvo of 36 conventional warheads, while the magnetic accelerator cannons spun up to full power and began hurling tungsten penetrators at the enemy formation. The crew watched their targeting displays with intense focus because they needed to see if their weapons could penetrate the legendary Caldrith shields. The missiles reached their targets first and detonated against invisible energy barriers that glowed briefly before absorbing the explosions completely. The tungsten rounds followed, and they too vanished into the shields without causing any visible damage. Hayes had expected this because the intelligence reports had been very clear about the effectiveness of Caldrith defensive technology, but he was not trying to destroy the enemy ships with this first volley. He was trying to learn about them and study their patterns and find weaknesses that could be exploited. Lieutenant Richardson was already analyzing the sensor data from the engagement, and her fingers flew across her console as she processed information at incredible speed. After 90 seconds of intense study, Richardson reported something that made everyone on the bridge sit up straighter. She had detected a pattern in the shield regeneration cycles of the Caldrith vessels. Every 7.3 seconds, the forward shield emitters experienced a microsecond fluctuation as they cycled through their regeneration sequence. The fluctuation was incredibly brief and almost impossible to detect unless someone was specifically looking for it. But it was there, and it represented a vulnerability that could potentially be exploited. Hayes immediately understood the implications, and he ordered all weapon systems to be recalibrated to synchronize their firing patterns with that exact interval. Chief Griffin protested that the timing would have to be absolutely perfect, and that even a fraction of a second off would mean the weapons would hit fully regenerated shields. Hayes acknowledged the difficulty but told him to make it work anyway because this might be their only chance to actually hurt the enemy. The weapons officers worked frantically to reprogram the firing solutions, and Richardson coordinated the timing sequences with computer-assisted precision. The Caldrith continued their assault, and the Defiant continued to take damage, but Hayes kept the ship in position and waited for his crew to complete their preparations. Morgan asked quietly if he was certain this would work, and Hayes admitted honestly that he had no idea but that they had to try something. After 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, Richardson reported that all weapons were synchronized and ready to fire on his command. Hayes took a deep breath and studied the tactical display one more time. The Caldrith ships had moved closer in their standard diamond formation, and they were concentrating their fire on the Defiant's forward sections in an attempt to overwhelm the armor through sustained bombardment. Hayes waited until the enemy ships were at optimal range and then gave the order to fire. Every weapon on the USS Defiant discharged simultaneously in a perfectly timed salvo. Missiles and tungsten penetrators and focused energy beams all converged on the lead Caldrith cruiser at the exact microsecond when its forward shields were cycling through regeneration. For one impossibly brief moment, the shields were at minimum strength and 3 missiles slipped through the gap. Before the barriers could fully restore themselves, the warheads detonated against the Caldrith hull, and for the first time in their long history of conquest, the aliens took real damage from an inferior enemy. The explosions tore through the outer hull plating, and secondary detonations rippled across 2 decks as internal systems overloaded. The cruiser did not explode, and it was far from destroyed, but it was hurt, and everyone on both sides knew it. The Caldrith formation broke apart immediately as the alien ships scattered in what looked like genuine shock. Their commander issued orders in a language that human translators could not process, but his intent was clear from his actions. The entire scout force withdrew at maximum acceleration, and within 2 minutes they had put 20,000 kilometers between themselves and the human destroyer. The bridge of the Defiant erupted in spontaneous cheering, and several crew members embraced each other in relief and joy. Hayes allowed them 30 seconds of celebration before calling for order and status reports. The damage control teams reported multiple hull breaches and significant damage to their forward armor, but nothing that would prevent them from continuing operations. Chief Griffin announced that the reactor was stable, and they had enough fuel and ammunition for at least 2 more engagements of similar intensity. Commander Morgan turned to Hayes with tears in her eye. War Commander Zethus of the Caldrith Empire stared at the tactical recordings of the engagement for the 7th time, and his fury grew with each viewing. 23 planetary conquests had fallen before his fleets without any significant resistance, and his reputation among the Caldrith military was one of absolute efficiency and overwhelming power. Now a single human destroyer had damaged one of his cruisers and forced his scout force to retreat like frightened juveniles. The humiliation burned in his chest like acid, and he knew that word of this defeat would spread throughout the Empire unless he corrected it immediately and decisively. He assembled a battle fleet of 30 warships and prepared to return to New Harmony with enough firepower to reduce the entire system to dust. His subordinate commanders questioned whether such overwhelming force was necessary for a single enemy vessel, but Zethus silenced their doubts with a glare that could have melted steel. He would not make the mistake of underestimating the humans again, and he would personally oversee the destruction of the ship that had dared to wound his forces. Captain Daniel Hayes watched the approaching Caldrith fleet on his long-range sensors and felt his stomach tighten with the weight of what was coming. 30 warships represented more than 10 times the firepower that had nearly destroyed the Defiant in their first engagement. Commander Lisa Morgan stood beside him, and her face had gone pale as the tactical computer calculated their odds of survival at less than 2%. The bridge crew maintained their discipline, but Hayes could see the fear in their eyes, and he could not blame them, because he felt that same fear in his own chest. But Hayes had not wasted the 3 days since the Caldrith retreat, and his crew had worked around the clock to prepare for exactly this scenario. Chief Engineer Peter Griffin had deployed a network of cheap sensor drones throughout the entire star system, using the Defiant's small shuttlecraft and automated launch systems. These drones were little more than basic sensors wrapped in minimal shielding, but they created a real-time tactical map that showed every ship in the system with perfect clarity. The Caldrith would have superior sensors on their individual ships, but Hayes would have superior battlefield awareness across the entire combat zone. Additionally, Griffin had recalibrated every weapon system on the Defiant to exploit the shield regeneration timing that Lieutenant Amy Richardson had discovered. The magnetic accelerator cannons now fired in synchronized bursts, and the missile targeting computers had been reprogrammed with new attack patterns designed to maximize the chances of catching enemy shields during their regeneration cycles. None of these improvements would be enough to overcome 30 enemy warships in a direct confrontation, but Hayes had no intention of fighting a direct confrontation. He called his senior officers together one final time before the battle began and explained his strategy in clear terms. They would not try to hold position as they had during the first engagement, because that would allow the Caldrith to concentrate their overwhelming firepower. Instead, they would use hit-and-run tactics and constant movement to prevent the enemy from establishing effective firing solutions. They would exploit the sensor network to maintain perfect awareness while denying the Caldrith that same advantage. Most importantly, they would be unpredictable in every possible way, because predictability was what allowed the Caldrith to dominate their enemies. Commander Morgan asked the question that everyone was thinking, which was how long they could possibly survive against such overwhelming odds. Hayes looked at each officer in turn and told them honestly that he did not know. But he also told them that every hour they survived was another hour for the Human Defense Coalition to evacuate colonies and fortify defenses elsewhere. Every hour they fought was another hour that proved humanity would not simply surrender. The officers nodded their understanding and returned to their stations with grim determination. The Caldrith fleet entered the New Harmony system in a massive hammer formation with their heaviest cruisers at the front and lighter vessels arranged in supporting positions. War Commander Zethus broadcast a message demanding the immediate surrender of the human vessel. But Hayes did not bother to respond, because words no longer mattered. Lieutenant Commander John Carter sat at the helm station with his hands all ready, moving across the controls before Hayes even gave the order. The USS Defiant's engines roared to full power, and the ship accelerated away from its orbital position in a direction that no tactical computer would have predicted. The Caldrith opened fire with every weapon in their arsenal, and space itself seemed to burn with the concentration of energy and kinetic projectiles. But the Defiant was no longer where their targeting computers said it should be, because Carter was flying the ship like it was a fighter craft rather than a destroyer. He pushed the engines past their rated limits and executed maneuvers that made the inertial dampeners scream in protest. The crew felt crushing G-forces that threatened to make them black out, but they held on and trusted their helmsman to keep them alive. Hayes watched the sensor network display and saw the Caldrith formation beginning to spread out as they tried to anticipate his movements. He gave rapid-fire orders to Carter, who responded instantly with course corrections that seemed to defy physics. The Defiant dove toward the inner planets and then reversed thrust to slingshot around a moon before accelerating back toward the enemy fleet at an angle that brought them within weapons range of 3 isolated cruisers. Richardson fired every available weapon in perfect synchronization and caught 2 of the 3 cruisers during their shield regeneration cycles. Missiles and tungsten penetrators tore into exposed hull plating and carved deep wounds across their surfaces. Before the Caldrith could respond, the Defiant was already racing away with its engines cold to mask its energy signature from enemy sensors. The ship drifted silently through space for 40 seconds while the Caldrith searched desperately for their target, and then Carter fired the engines again in a completely different direction. This pattern repeated for hours, with the Defiant appearing seemingly at random to strike at vulnerable targets before vanishing into the sensor shadows created by planets and debris fields. War Commander Zethus tried to anticipate the human ship's movements, but Hayes refused to establish any predictable patterns. Sometimes the Defiant attacked from above the orbital plane and sometimes from below. Sometimes it maintained radio silence, and sometimes it broadcast false sensor signatures to confuse enemy tracking systems. The sensor drone network gave Hayes a decisive advantage because he could see every enemy ship at all times, while the Caldrith struggled to maintain target locks on his constantly moving vessel. When clusters of enemy ships moved to cut off what they thought was his escape route, Hayes simply went in a completely different direction. When they tried to establish firing patterns based on his previous attacks, he changed his approach entirely. After 6 hours of continuous combat, the Defiant had inflicted serious damage on 4 Caldreth cruisers and destroyed 2 smaller corvettes. The human ship had taken damage as well, with multiple hull breaches and overloaded systems, but Chief Griffin and his engineering teams performed miracles to keep everything functioning. Medical Officer Lieutenant Greg Foster worked frantically to treat crew members suffering from G-force injuries and exhaustion, but nobody asked to be relieved from their stations. After 12 hours, the Caldreth formation had become increasingly disorganized as War Commander Zethis tried desperately to adapt to an enemy that refused to fight by any recognizable rules. His ships were designed for overwhelming frontal assaults against enemies who fought conventionally, and he had no doctrine for dealing with a single vessel that struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before his forces could respond effectively. After 16 hours, Zethis made a decision that shocked his subordinate commanders. He ordered his entire fleet to withdraw beyond weapons range and establish a siege perimeter around New Harmony. He would not allow this human ship to continue, embarrassing his forces, and he would not sacrifice any more vessels in pursuit of an enemy who refused to be cornered. Instead, he would trap them in this system and wait for them to run out of supplies or ammunition or fuel. The USS Defiant drifted in high orbit above New Harmony, and Hayes studied the new Caldreth formation on his tactical display. The enemy had established a blockade that completely surrounded the planet at a distance of 200,000 kilometers. No ship could enter or leave the system without passing through their lines. Morgan observed quietly that they had just been placed under siege, and Hayes nodded his agreement, but he also pointed out that the siege worked both ways. The Caldreth fleet was now tied down in this system and could not advance deeper into human territory. Every day they remained here was another day that other colonies could be evacuated and other defensive lines could be established. The war had just become a battle of endurance, and Hayes was betting that human stubbornness would outlast alien pride. He ordered the crew to rotate rest schedules and begin rationing supplies for an extended siege. Then he sent an encrypted message to Admiral Richard Torres at Central Command explaining the situation and requesting that no relief forces be sent. The Defiant woe. 3 weeks into the siege, both sides had reached a point where exhaustion and frustration had become constant companions. The USS Defiant floated in a slow orbit around New Harmony, and its hull bore the scars of dozens of skirmishes and probing attacks. Captain Daniel Hayes walked through the corridors of his ship and saw the fatigue in every face he passed. The crew had been living on 4-hour sleep rotations for 21 days, and the strain was beginning to show in small mistakes and delayed responses. Chief Engineer Peter Griffin reported that the ship's fusion reactor was operating at efficiency levels that pushed the boundaries of safe operation, and that several critical systems were held together more by luck and prayer than proper. Engineering. Commander Lisa Morgan had done her best to maintain crew morale through the endless days of tension, but even her usually cheerful demeanor had faded into something more grimly determined. Lieutenant Amy Richardson looked like she had aged 5 years in 3 weeks, and her hands trembled slightly when she worked at the tactical console. Medical Officer Lieutenant Greg Foster had treated dozens of crew members for stress-related conditions and exhaustion-related injuries. The food supplies had been stretched to the breaking point through careful rationing, and every meal now consisted of recycled protein paste and vitamin supplements that tasted like cardboard. But despite all the hardship and fatigue, the crew maintained their discipline and continued to man their stations with professional dedication. They had accomplished something that no other military force had managed against the Caldreth Empire, and that achievement gave them a sense of purpose that transcended physical discomfort. Hayes knew that his crew would continue fighting, as long as he asked them to, and that knowledge both humbled him and terrified him, because he understood that their lives depended entirely on his decisions. War Commander Zethis faced his own pressures. Aboard his flagship, and the weight of command had become almost unbearable. The Caldreth High Command sent him daily messages demanding explanations for why an entire battle fleet had been tied down by a single human vessel for nearly a month. His fellow commanders throughout the Empire had begun sending subtle messages of mockery disguised as concerns for his well-being. Intelligence reports indicated that human forces throughout occupied space had begun adopting similar tactics to those used by the USS Defiant and that Caldrith. Casualties had increased significantly across all fronts. Zethus studied the tactical data from the siege and tried to find some weakness in the human ship's defenses that could be exploited. But Captain Hayes had proven to be frustratingly unpredictable in every engagement, and the Caldrith had not been able to establish any reliable patterns in his behavior. The human commander seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of battlefield tactics that defied conventional military doctrine. Zethus had fought against dozens of species over his long career, but none of them had challenged him the way this single human captain had. The war commander made a decision that he knew would either restore his honor or end his career. He would commit his entire fleet to one final overwhelming assault that would destroy the USS Defiant regardless of the cost in Caldrith lives and ships. His subordinate commanders protested that such an attack would result in heavy casualties, but Zethus silenced their objections with cold authority. Honor and reputation mattered, more than a few lost vessels, and he would accept whatever price was necessary to eliminate this human ship that had become a symbol of resistance throughout the galaxy. Hayes watched the Caldrith formation change on his tactical displays and immediately understood what was happening. The enemy fleet was abandoning its siege positions and moving into an attack formation that positioned all 30 warships for a simultaneous assault. Lieutenant Richardson confirmed his assessment and calculated that the Defiant would be facing approximately 40 times its own firepower in the coming engagement. Commander Morgan asked quietly if they should attempt to break through the blockade and escape, but Hayes shook his head. Because running now would make everything they had accomplished meaningless, he called a meeting with his senior officers in the small conference room adjacent to the bridge, and for the first time since the siege he spoke to them with complete honesty about their situation. He told them that they probably would not survive the next engagement because the Caldrith were bringing overwhelming force and abandoning any pretense of tactical finesse. The crew had fought brilliantly for 3 weeks, but there were limits to what courage and skill could accomplish against such numerical superiority. Chief Griffin suggested that they could evacuate to New Harmony Colony and scuttle the ship to prevent the Caldrith from capturing it intact. Several junior officers agreed that survival should be their priority at this point, but Hayes explained that the USS Defiant had become more than just a warship over the past 3 weeks. News of their resistance had spread throughout human space and inspired countless others to stand and fight, rather than surrender. If they abandoned ship now, it would send a message of defeat that could damage morale across the entire human defense coalition. Lieutenant Commander John Carter proposed an alternative plan which involved a suicide ramming attack on the Caldrith flagship. If they were going to die anyway, they should take War Commander Zethus with them and eliminate the commander responsible for coordinating the enemy's conquest efforts. Several officers supported this idea and argued that it would at least ensure their sacrifice had maximum strategic impact. Hayes listened to all the suggestions and then made his decision with the calm authority that had defined his command throughout the crisis. If this was going to be their last battle, then they would fight it exactly as they had fought every previous engagement. They would be smart and unpredictable, and they would make the Caldrith pay the highest possible price for their victory. He ordered Griffin to reroute all remaining power to weapons, systems and engines and shields while reducing life support to absolute minimum levels. The chief engineer protested that such power distribution would disable safety systems and environmental controls, but Hayes told him to do it anyway, because comfort no longer mattered. He ordered Richardson to prepare every remaining weapon for simultaneous firing and to synchronize all targeting computers for maximum efficiency. He told Carter to disable the inertial dampener safety limiters because they would need to execute maneuvers that exceeded normal operational parameters. Every decision was made with the understanding that they were trading long-term survivability for short-term combat effectiveness. Hayes then did something he had never done before, which was to address the entire crew through the ship-wide communication system. He told them that they had already accomplished more than anyone had the right to expect, and that they had changed the course of the war through their courage and determination. He told them that the Caldrith were coming with everything they had, and that the odds of survival were essentially zero. But he also told them that how they fought this last battle would matter more than whether they won, because their example would inspire others long after the USS Defiant was gone. The crew responded with quiet determination rather than fear or panic. They had been living with the possibility of death for 3 weeks, and they had made their peace with it. Medical Officer Foster distributed stimulant injections to keep everyone alert and functional during the coming battle. Engineering teams sealed bulkheads and reinforced critical systems. Weapons officers ran final checks on targeting computers and firing solutions. The Caldrith fleet began its approach in a massive wall formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. Every weapon on every ship was charged and ready to fire. War Commander Zethus had ordered his forces to shoot until nothing remained of the human vessel, but expanding clouds of atoms. The attack would be brutal and absolute, and there would be no possibility of survival for anyone aboard the target ship. Hayes watched them come, and his hand rested steady on his command chair. He looked around the bridge at the faces of his officers and crew members and felt overwhelming pride at what they had accomplished together. Commander Morgan caught his eye and gave him a small nod of support. Lieutenant Richardson's fingers hovered over her firing controls. Chief Griffin reported from engineering that all systems were at maximum output. Carter sat at the helm with his hands already moving across the controls in preparation for the impossible maneuvers that would be required. The Caldrith fleet entered weapons range, and War Commander Zethus gave the order to fire everything simultaneously. Space itself seemed to explode with concentrated energy as 30 warships discharged their full arsenals at a single target. The USS Defiant accelerated directly toward the incoming storm of destruction, and Hayes gave the only order that mattered. He told his crew to make it count. The space around New Harmony transformed into a hell of energy weapons and kinetic projectiles as 30 Caldrith warships unleashed everything they had at the single human destroyer. Lieutenant Commander John Carter pushed the USS Defiant through maneuvers that would have been impossible under normal circumstances, but Chief Engineer Peter Griffin had disabled every safety system and pushed the engines beyond their design limits. The ship twisted and rolled through the storm of incoming fire like a leaf caught in a hurricane, and the crew experienced crushing G-forces that made their vision blur and their bones ache. Several officers blacked out momentarily from the extreme acceleration, but Medical Officer Lieutenant Greg Foster moved through the bridge with stimulant injectors to keep everyone conscious and functional. Captain Daniel Hayes gripped his command chair and watched the tactical display through eyes that watered from the pressure. Commander Lisa Morgan called out damage reports as hull breaches erupted across multiple decks, and the structural integrity fields began to fail under the relentless bombardment. The experimental armor continued to protect them from quantum disruption weapons, but the sheer volume of kinetic impacts was tearing the ship apart piece by piece. Lieutenant Amy Richardson coordinated the weapons fire with computer-assisted precision, and every shot was timed to exploit the shield regeneration cycles that she had discovered weeks ago. The USS Defiant's missiles and magnetic accelerator cannons fired in perfect synchronization and caught 6 enemy vessels during their vulnerable moments. 2 Caldrith cruisers suffered critical damage to their propulsion systems and began drifting out of formation. The return fire intensified immediately as War Commander Zethus ordered his forces to concentrate their attacks on the damaged sections of the human ship. Then something happened that nobody on either side had anticipated. Long-range sensors detected multiple new contacts entering the system at high velocity, and the identification transponder showed them to be human warships from the Defense Coalition. 32 vessels led by Admiral Richard Torres aboard the dreadnought USS Vengeance dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the New Harmony system. The Admiral had made an executive decision to reverse course and relieve the besieged Defiant despite orders to maintain defensive positions around Earth. Torres had spent 3 weeks watching intelligence reports about the siege and listening to intercepted Caldrith communications that revealed growing frustration and confusion within their military hierarchy. He realized that Captain Hayes had done more than just tie down one enemy fleet. The defense of New Harmony had drawn a significant portion of Caldrith forward forces into a single location, where they could be engaged decisively. More importantly, Torres had convinced Dr. Karen White to accelerate production of new weapons based on her quantum disruption research. The relief fleet carried prototype quantum disruptor torpedoes specifically designed to counter Caldrith shield technology. These weapons used the same principles that made the Defiant's armor resistant to enemy attacks. but weaponized them to create cascading failures in alien defensive systems. Dr. White had worked without sleep for 2 weeks to produce enough torpedoes to equip the fleet, and her exhausted face appeared in the tactical briefings that Torres reviewed. During the journey to New Harmony, War Commander Zethus saw his tactical situation collapse in real time as the human reinforcements accelerated toward his position. He found himself trapped between the damaged but still fighting Defiant and a fresh enemy fleet, equipped with weapons that his intelligence services knew nothing about. His formation began to fragment as individual ship commanders tried to respond to threats from multiple directions. The disciplined wall formation that had seemed so overwhelming minutes ago dissolved into chaos as Kaldrith cruisers maneuvered independently without coordination. Captain Hayes saw the opportunity immediately and gave orders that pushed his damaged ship to its absolute limits. The USS Defiant turned toward the Kaldrith flagship, despite having hull breaches across 7 decks and failing systems throughout the vessel. The crew responded without hesitation, even though they all understood that this attack run would probably destroy what remained of their ship. Carter plotted a direct course toward War Commander Zethus's command vessel, while Richardson prepared every remaining weapon for a final, synchronized barrage. The Defiant accelerated toward the enemy flagship, trailing atmosphere from multiple hull breaches and leaving a visible contrail of vented gases. The Kaldrith concentrated their defensive fire on the approaching destroyer, but Admiral Torres's fleet had already engaged from the opposite direction. Quantum disruptor torpedoes slammed into Kaldrith shields and created cascading energy failures that rippled across entire vessels. The alien defensive systems that had seemed impenetrable for years suddenly collapsed under weapons, specifically designed to exploit their operating principles. Hayes gave the order to fire, and the USS Defiant discharged every remaining missile and every charged weapon in one massive salvo, directed at the Kaldrith flagship. The enemy shields flickered and failed under the initial impacts, and then the quantum disruptor torpedoes from the relief fleet arrived simultaneously. The combined assault tore through the flagship's hull plating and caused secondary explosions that rippled across multiple decks. War Commander Zethus watched his command systems fail one by one and made the most difficult decision of his military career. He ordered a full retreat of all Kaldrith forces from the New Harmony system. His subordinate commanders hesitated because retreat was not part of their military doctrine, and the Empire had never withdrawn from a battle in living memory. But Zethus knew that remaining would result in the complete destruction of his fleet, and he could not allow that to happen. The surviving Kaldrith vessels disengaged from combat and accelerated toward the edge of the system at maximum speed. Several damaged cruisers were left behind because they lacked functional propulsion systems, but Zethus prioritized saving his mobile forces over rescuing crippled ships. The USS Defiant drifted in space after the enemy withdrawal and emergency. Alerts sounded throughout the vessel. Damage control teams worked frantically to seal hull breaches, while engineering crews tried to prevent reactor overloads. The ship had taken catastrophic damage during the final attack run, and Chief Griffin reported that life support was failing in multiple sections. Medical teams moved through the corridors treating injured crew members, and the casualty count climbed to 37 dead with dozens more wounded. But they had survived. Against odds that should have been impossible, the USS Defiant and its crew had lived through the engagement and forced the Kaldrith Empire into its first battlefield retreat. Hayes slumped in his command chair and felt exhaustion wash over him like a physical weight. Commander Morgan moved to his side and put a hand on his shoulder without saying anything because words seemed inadequate for what they had just accomplished. Admiral Torres sent shuttles to the damaged destroyer to provide emergency assistance and medical supplies. Engineering teams from the relief fleet began assessing the damage and concluded that the Defiant could be repaired, but would need extensive work in a proper shipyard. Torres himself took a shuttle to visit Captain Hayes, and when they met on the battered bridge, the Admiral rendered a formal salute that Hayes returned with trembling hands. Torres told him that he had changed the course of the war and proven that the Kaldrith could be defeated. Human forces throughout the conflict zones had been studying the tactical recordings from New Harmony and adapting the methods that Hayes had pioneered. The alien advance had stalled in multiple sectors as human commanders learned to exploit enemy predictability and fight on their own terms. Hayes accepted the praise but immediately deflected it to his crew, who had executed every impossible order without hesitation. 3 months later, the USS Defiant emerged from the repair yards with upgraded systems and new armor plating. The war against the Kaldrith Empire continued, but the dynamics had shifted fundamentally. The aliens no longer swept through systems effortlessly, because humanity had learned how to resist. Negotiations had begun between the two powers, and although both sides remained cautious, there was genuine hope for a peaceful resolution. Captain Hayes stood on the bridge of his restored ship and prepared to depart on a new patrol mission. His crew had become legends throughout human space, and they received recognition and medals from grateful governments. But Hayes insisted that the real story was not about individual heroism, but about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. Commander Morgan asked him if he had known they would survive when the siege began, and Hayes admitted honestly that he had not. He told her that he had simply believed their fight would matter regardless of the outcome. The USS Defiant represented something larger than one ship or one crew. It represented humanity's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds, and the determination to stand and fight even when logic suggested retreat. That spirit had inspired others throughout human space to resist the Kaldrith, and that inspiration had changed everything. The Defiant's engines powered up, and the ship departed from dock to resume its duties.